Andrew, could you get going, please?
Yep, thanks very much, Andrew. Hope everyone can hear me fine. Welcome everyone to the webinar. I see there's 12 of you here today, so welcome. I'm not sure if any of you have been in a previous webinars that I've run throughout the year. Each time policy changes slightly or something that was going to happen does actually happen. So this is an updated version of the webinar I did probably last time around about June, and a number of things have happened in September this year which I'll come on to. So let me just kick off with a bit about who we are and what we do. So we're GL Assessment. We're the biggest provider of what you might call formative assessments in the UK and increasingly internationally. We were originally founded by the NFPR, which is the National Foundation for Educational Research, and we probably work with around 2/3 of primary and secondary schools. Our leading tests are for ability, literacy, and numeracy. We've been working in these areas for around 30 years. We also produce a number of materials, assessments, screeners for special educational needs children. Our tests are produced in paper format, but increasingly we're also delivering them electronically. And over the last 6-7 years or so, over 7 million tests have been taken using our own online system, which we call TestWise. I guess the main difference from the paper versions, it's the same test. The main difference really from the paper versions in terms of the customer is the fact that the reports that come from the digital versions of our tests teachers can access immediately, and that's obviously quite a big bonus if they're looking to do things with the pupils on the basis of the results of the test very quickly. You might argue that our tests really are ways of teachers getting hold of the data. The data is the key thing, and the data we present from the test in the form of reports. These come in different formats. Some have more narrative, some have more charts and graphs and figures and numbers. But what we always try and do is make sure the reports make it as easy as possible for the teacher to understand what's going on with the pupil. Over the last few years, we've increased the number of reports that our tests issue. So, for example, in the last few years, we've added parent reports to most of our leading tests. Deliberate really on the basis that schools are saying to us more and more, we need to communicate with parents regarding their son, daughter, how they're doing in the school, how they're doing nationally. And so we made available to teachers parent reports, which just put the data in a slightly easier way to understand, and those have gone down very well. So we have a range of reports that come from our tests. So let's kick off, as this is all about life after levels, let me kick off about levels generally in the national curriculum. So as you're probably all aware, levels were scrapped in the national curriculum in September, so 2 months ago. And one of the reasons for this was the fact that the government in the UK took the view that levels are not the right way of moving forward in terms of measuring pupils' ability and attainment. So that first bullet point there, this is actually a quotation from a government document. And so government says, we believe the system is complicated and difficult to understand, especially for parents. It also encourages teachers to focus on the pupil's current level rather than consider more broadly what the pupil can actually do. Prescribing a single detailed approach to assessment does not fit with the curriculum freedoms we are giving schools. So what the government is really saying there is that it devised the new national curriculum to be a bit more open, a bit freer, less loaded with lots of statements about you must do this, you must do that, to give more freedom to schools. So at the same time, they took the view that, well, if we're doing that in terms of the content of the curriculum, we ought to follow, it ought to follow that we'll do that as well in terms of the assessment regime. So the introduction of the new curriculum, as I say, September this year, so a couple of months ago, they took the view it's time for a rethink, and they introduced the concept of assessment without levels. The interesting piece there, as I put in the last bullet point, government was very concerned and is increasingly concerned about parents accessing information about their pupil. but as I mentioned earlier about our reports, in a way that the parents could actually understand. And government in its research found that parents took the view that levels were just too complicated to understand. They didn't quite know what working towards a level 4, for example, might mean. The levels were too broad, they were too abstract. And so again, the government's taken the view that, well, if we get rid of levels, there are other ways that we can inform parents about how well their son or daughter are doing. So I thought we'd do still our first vote at this moment in time. And what I was going to ask is, how many of you out there are actually aware that the national curriculum levels were removed a couple of months ago? It's just an interesting one. We've, in the last year really, done a number of Life After Levels roadshows where we've gone around England and presented our views on Life After Levels and everything else. And it's interesting, we do find that there's a reasonable number of teachers who weren't aware and haven't been aware that levels were actually being replaced. So I just thought I'd ask a question to find the answer. Okay, so that's interesting. So, oh, that's great. So 2/3 of you roughly were aware. Small proportion, no. Small proportion, not applicable. But it's good to see that 2/3 of you are aware that national curriculum levels have been removed. And I'll come on to another little voting thing at the end of this slide. So what's replaced levels? Well, as I say there, nothing. And that second bullet point, again, another quote from government. So what they've said is the current system of national curriculum levels and level descriptions will be removed and not replaced. From September 2014, the new national curriculum will make no mention of levels. And from 2 months ago, that has indeed been the case. So it's what I was saying earlier, really. This is all about freedom. However, and moving on to the second part of this slide, what the government has also said is, however, you've still got to do other things where you can be showing that you're tracking pupil progress. So they've added, but teachers will continue to track progress and provide regular information to parents. So there's that whole thing about parents again. How they do so will be for them to decide. We will not prescribe a single system for ongoing assessment and reporting. So government saying there, we've got freedom and we're not going to tell you what to do, but you've still got to do something to demonstrate that you're tracking pupil progress. Schools will be free to design their approaches to assessment to support pupil attainment and progression. So again, freedom for schools there. And the last bullet point, which has come up really in the last month or so, and there was government had been planning this for a while, for probably about the last year. And there's actually now a consultation that's out from the Department for Education, which is about their views on what they're calling performance descriptors. And what the performance descriptors will be, there'll be statutory teacher-based assessment for the end of Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2 from 2015 and 16. So what there'll be is there'll be a series of narratives, a series of descriptors that will suggest that to demonstrate mastery or progress in the curriculum, pupils need to demonstrate this, that, or the other. And that this, that, or the other will be outlined by the performance descriptors. And as the consultation states there, as I put in quotation marks, we will set high standards for what pupils should be expected to achieve at the end of the key stages, but between these points, it is for schools to decide how to assess pupils against their curriculum. So the performance descriptors that teachers will use, and the teachers will need to interpret those descriptors, they will be used at the end of Key Stage 2, so that's 7, and the end of Key Stage 1, that's 7, and end of Key Stage 2, that's 11. Between those points, though, i.e. year on year, schools will be free to use what they wish to use to demonstrate that progress is being made. And as I mentioned, although they'll be free to do that, they will also need to show Ofsted in England, the other inspectorate overseas, how that progress is being measured and how accurate that progress is. So we've mentioned about levels, and we've mentioned that they were scrapped a couple of months ago. We've mentioned that schools can introduce their own methodologies. Certainly a majority of you are aware that national curriculum levels have been scrapped. So I was just going to ask a second question now, a second voting question. And that is, so how many of you have a replacement system already in place? I'll just wait for the results to come up. because again, as I mentioned just earlier, that government and DfE have been talking about getting rid of levels for probably now a good year or so. But when we've gone around the country, we have noticed that a number of schools have not necessarily had time to think yet about what they're going to replace levels with. So I thought I'd ask a question to see what results we get here. Oh, that's interesting. So, yeah, and that kind of follows what we're finding in the UK, as I mentioned. So about a fifth of you have got an assessment system already in place. About half of you don't, which is interesting. I mean, the Ofsted, so the inspection regime in England, what they said is they're going to allow schools to use the academic year, this academic year 2014/15, as almost a transition year. So they did initially say, okay, everyone's got to have a new system from September 14. I think they've realised that not all schools are ready yet to do that. So some schools we know might still talk about levels across this academic year, but certainly from probably June, July next year, and then certainly from the new academic year 2015, September 2015, Ofsted, the Inspectorate, when it goes into schools in England, will be looking for assessment regimes that have replaced levels. And just talking about Ofsted, I thought I'd put this slide up because it's quite interesting in terms of what the Inspectorate is looking for in terms of the replacement assessment regimes within schools. So Michael Wilshaw, who's the Chief Inspector of Ofsted in England, he sent a letter to all schools in early July, so a few months ago. And for the first time, it was really him putting down on paper what the Inspectorate would look for in school assessment regimes from September, i.e. from a couple of months ago. And in his letter he sent to all schools, he said that once levels have been scrapped, inspectors will look for the following things, and the things are in the blue boxes. So I'll just run through those quickly. From the top left, so inspectors will be talking to leaders in schools about the school's use of formative and summative assessment and how this improves teaching and raises attainment. So what they're saying there is we will actually be asking questions of the senior leadership team in schools of what they're using and how they're using it. Michael Wilshaw also says that the inspectors will evaluate how well pupils are doing against age-related expectations as set out by the school and the national curriculum, where the curriculum applies. So what's being said there is they will want to see, the inspectorate will want to see assessment regimes say something about where the pupil is in terms of that pupil's age against the expectations of that pupil's performance at that age, on the basis of the school, but also on the basis of nationally, so national benchmarking. And I'll come on to some bits and pieces about that shortly. Bottom right, evaluate the way, so inspectors will evaluate the way the school reports to parents, so there's that parents piece again there, on pupils' progress and attainment. Inspectors will assess whether reports help parents to understand how their children are doing in relation to the standards expected. So the inspectorate will be talking to the school about how it reports progress to parents, and the inspectors will say to the school that they're happy that the reporting that the school is using to the parent does indeed help the parent understand where her pupil is, how that pupil's doing against the curriculum standards, how that pupil's doing against other pupils in the school and nationally. So important piece there again about the school communicating to parents. And the final box there, the inspectorate will consider how the school uses assessment information to identify pupils who are falling behind in their learning or who need additional support to reach their full potential, including the most able. So again, what the inspectorate's saying there is that it's not just about, yes, you're running an assessment, and it's not just about, and you're getting the data out of that assessment. What's just as important is how are you as a school using that assessment information? So partly to identify the pupils that may not be doing so well, partly to identify the pupils who might be gifted and talented, but overall to identify all the pupils so that they're making the right progress for their ability level. So what government and the DfE are saying is that it's not just about testing pupils and looking at the data in terms of are they doing quite well or not? It's more about using the assessment information proactively so that, for example, the right intervention strategies for teaching and learning can be implemented in the school according to individual pupil needs. So I'll just come on to two pieces really. I'm going to do a little bit on primary and then I'll do a little bit on secondary, just in terms of the mix of the audience here. And where we are today really stems from the primary assessment and accountability consultation. And the Department for Education announced in July last year, 2013, that it would undertake a review of the primary assessment system. So you might argue that where we are now is a year and a bit on from that. Now, we as GL Assessment were invited to give evidence to the consultation. So the DFE had a series of questions it asked. We gave various answers. There was also an oral evidence session that we attended. So the DFE gathered and corralled all the information from the various people it talked to, and in March this year, it published its response. So what it said was, in terms of moving forwards for primary assessment and accountability, some of the key things will be, so the first one was an announcement that a baseline check will be introduced at reception stage in schools, which is the point at which children enter national schooling, so that's at 4 or 5. So there will be a new baseline test that would assess literacy and numeracy. That would be optional from September next year, and then it will become more statutory from September 2016. There would also be a focus on whether pupils will be secondary ready with the term at 11. So when pupils enter schools at 4 or 5, to have them undertake the baseline check that would suggest that they were on target to be ready for secondary school 7 years down the line. And the response also included details of new floor standards, and that there will be a new scaled score that would replace levels. So the accountability system will be a new scaled score, and I'll say something about that shortly. So one of the main things that came out of the consultation was the reception baseline. So that's quite an important thing. It's a brand new thing, so I'll talk about that in a little more depth now. So the reception baseline, government has said it will be used as a starting point from which to measure a school's progress in terms of where it's taking its pupils that come in at 4 and 5. The assessments that schools will be used as predictors of attainment, whilst also reflecting the ages and abilities of reception children. Now, the baseline assessment, although it will be a government assessment, as it were, it's not actually on this occasion being produced by government. What's happening on this occasion is the government has said, okay, suppliers of tests, we want you to develop something, and then we want you to go through a bid process where your test, if it meets all the criteria that we will set out, it will basically become approved, and therefore we will publish a list to all schools that will say these are the approved tests and these are the tests that you can use to baseline pupils from September 2015. To do that, they produced a range of criteria and for suppliers. We're in the middle at the moment of developing a new baseline assessment. It's very innovative. It's going to be a tablet-based approach, because the whole point of the baseline assessment is that it will be one-to-one between the administrator, the teacher, and the pupil. And as I say, we're in the middle of producing that at the moment. The deadline for bids to go into the government is the 15th of December. So we're also in the middle of writing our bid document as well. So we'll have something for the reception baseline that will be published next May 2015, in time for the actual baseline testing window for the first year of pupils that have to do that, which will be September 2015. So a number of things here as well in terms of what the government is asking us to look at in terms of the development of our baseline tests. They're interested in how the results of the test will be communicated to parents. Schools will be encouraged to take an improved baseline assessment from September next year, as I've already mentioned. And the list of those will come out in April 2015. So again, the key to the baseline assessment will be, well, it's got to be good for the, it's got to be easy for the teacher to administer, because we already know that much of the administration will be by teaching assistants, so not necessarily specialists, so non-specialist teachers. You've also got pupils of 4 or 5, and we all know that pupils of 4 or 5 don't necessarily sit still for too long. We know from our research that 10, 20 minutes max is about the right way of going about things. So we've got to also make the test engaging, we've got to make it easy to use, and we've got to make it quite fun. The main thing as well about the reception baseline test, though, is it's got to come out with results which are highly accurate and very reliable. Therefore, we'll have a good range of reports. I already mentioned our reports earlier on. We'll have a good range of reports that we'll issue from the baseline assessment that will allow teachers to say, this is where the pupil is, this is where the pupil might get to when they're secondary ready, and there'll be a suite of reports also for parents. Now, as part of the primary assessment consultation, the government also announced that there will be new floor standards, as they called them. And from 2016, a new floor standard will be holding schools to account, looking at pupils' progress and their achievement. So the baseline assessment, and this is where the purpose of the baseline assessment comes in, that will be used, that's part of the new floor standards, and will be used to assess pupils' progress from reception stage to age 11. So that's the thing that will kick everything off as pupils enter schools. And an attainment standard will be devised based on primary schools equipping pupils for secondary school by the end of Key Stage 2. So government is currently working on a system, I've already mentioned the performance descriptors, so it's working on a system which will allow schools to work out as a pupil moves through schooling from 5 to 11, is that pupil on target to be where they're supposed to be at 11 on the basis of the results that they had from the baseline assessment they took at 4 or 5. And the primary school will be above the floor standard if it's shown that pupils are making sufficient progress in reading, writing and maths at Key Stage 2 from their starting point in the reception baseline, or 85% or more of pupils meet the new expected standard at the end of Key Stage 2. So those new floor standards are the things that will hold schools to account. The system that the government's currently working on to replace the levelling system is what they're calling a scaled score. So if you take the view that under the old levels regime, pupils were expected to get to level 4 at Key Stage 2, or 4B in actual fact as I put there. What the government is looking to introduce, as I say, is a new scaled score, and they're taking the view that the scaled score of 100 will be at the same level as the old level B under the old level system. So pupils will be expected to be progressing towards a score of 100. So as they go through primary school, they will be measured against that scaled score. So that's a bit about primary and the baseline assessment. Let me come on to secondary now. So at the same time as doing a primary accountability review, the government also in 2013 carried out a review of assessment at secondary. Similar way to the primary, it corralled people's views, it asked various teachers, suppliers such as ourselves, other agencies to do with education, what they thought about secondary assessment and how it might be improved. The government reported in October 2013, so just over a year ago, and I just wanted to highlight a couple of things there. So one of the things it mentioned, and again this is all about parents, as I've been saying for the last 20 minutes or so, parents are increasingly key in the eye line of government. The government suggested that on each school's website we will make sure there is a snapshot of so pupils' performance in a standard format, so parents can quickly understand the school's effectiveness. So what the government's saying there is that it wants to make life as easy as possible for parents that will get into a school's website to see where that school is on a performance basis nationally, and to look at key data from pupils in that school. So the DfE also said in the consultation response that parents should receive regular information about their own child's progress. This will help parents to hold schools to account for the teaching of their children and help them choose the right school for their child. We will show information about progress and attainment in school. So again, that's all about giving parents the information that government feels parents should have in terms of knowing how well their child is doing in the school, and therefore also, I guess to some degree, giving parents some weaponry really to go into the school if they wish to do that, to hold the school to account. Now that second to last bullet point is a key one. So the consultation response also came up with the Progress 8 measure, which is a new thing. And Progress 8 is all about showing attainment across 8 subjects and the percentage of pupils achieving a C grade or better in English and in maths. And so the new floor standard at secondary will be the minimum requirement set out in the Progress 8 measure. So I'll quickly come on to the next slide. So this, in summary, is about Progress 8. So from 2016, Progress 8 will be the main accountability measure used by the DfE for secondary school performance. Attainment at the end of Key Stage 4, so it's GCSE, IGCSE, whatever, will be benchmarked against predicted grades based on the pupil's Key Stage 2 attainment. The school score will be an average of the pupil's scores. So what Progress 8 is all about is that schools that take the national curriculum, secondary schools, will be held to account on the basis of the results that might be predicted from the pupil's performance in the Key Stage 2 SATs exams at 11. So to some degree, this is all new, and we found for some secondary schools slightly worrying. They've been slightly worried about it because secondary schools that don't really have much effect on primary, unless they're an all the way through school and all the way through 5, 16, 18 school, because they don't always have that much effect on the primaries and the pupils coming in from primary, they're a bit worried that they're going to be held to account on the basis of the results that the pupils get at primary school. So that's going to be an interesting new area for secondary schools. So new floor standards will be introduced for Progress 8, and the main floor standard is that schools will be below the floor if pupils make an average of half a grade less progress than expected across their 8 subjects. So secondary schools increasingly will be needing to track their pupils from 11 through to 16 on the basis of how well are those pupils progressing on the basis of the projected performance from the Key Stage 2 results. So that's interesting, because previously secondary schools have largely taken the view that, well, as soon as the primary pupils get into secondary, we'll kind of start again. We'll deal with them as we wish to deal with them. Progress 8 changes that to a certain extent. Progress 8, it's not complicated. There's a number of different measures that sit behind it. What we've done, we've produced a little guidance piece that, if you're interested, we'll make that available to you, and we can give you a few more details about that at the end of this session. So I've talked about more freedom for schools. I've also talked about, at the same time, the government is saying, but we still want you to measure pupil progress. We still want you to report to parents. We've still got floor standards. There are still certain expectations we have for you schools. So if you're looking at a curriculum and assessment framework, there are a number of core principles, you might argue, that should underpin your assessment regime. So I put this together really from a variety of things I've read over the last year, talking to government, talking to inspectors, and so on. So these are some of the things that a school's assessment framework should be underpinned by. So it should be teacher-led. So ongoing teacher-led assessment is crucial to effective teaching. So it's about the teacher-led assessment, but it's also about what you do with the data and what that data might mean in terms of influencing the relevant teaching and learning strategies for pupils. I've already mentioned that schools have the freedom to decide how to teach their curriculum and how to track pupils' progress. So again, in your assessment framework and your curriculum framework, you'll want to show how you're delivering the curriculum and you're delivering your assessment regime, but also how you're making the most of the freedoms that allow you to do that. So that's kind of, in a way, about personalising learning for the pupils that are in your schools. Both summative teacher assessment and external testing are important. So there will always be external tests, so IGCSE, GCSEs, A-levels, whatever you use at the end to measure final pupil performance. But just as key as the summative is the teacher assessment in that as well. because to a large extent you won't necessarily want to leave it to the last minute to find out whether people might be and how well that people might end up performing in the final examinations. So ongoing progress tracking is important. Accountability must be fair and transparent. So in your assessment framework, you'll want to be suggesting how the pupils are being measured, how you're embracing all types of pupils, gifted and talented, maybe some special needs, whatever it might be. So it has to be fair. The framework should be suggesting that you're looking at both progress and attainment for understanding school performance overall. And towards the end of this presentation, I'll come on to how we do that with our assessment methodology. And also a broad range of information about the school's performance should be available to parents and the wider public. So I'm sure you've all noted that I've mentioned parents a lot so far in this presentation. And I mentioned on the previous couple of slides as well that what government is saying is that schools on their websites will need to also suggest in a very easy to access way to parents, this is how the school is performing. So these are the, I guess you could say they're the underpinning tenets of a good curriculum and assessment framework. So I was just going to ask a question really here, and that of those of you that have got your assessment system in place, and a number of you do, you mentioned, how many of you are confident that it meets the above? I suppose a number of you will say you don't have a system in place because nearly 50% of you don't yet. But I'll be interested in those 20%, how comfortable you feel that your assessment regime that you've implemented in the place of levels meets the framework. So I'll just wait for the results to come up there.
Hi Andrew, we're just waiting for a few people to answer, so we'll just wait a few more.
Okay, no worries. And as I say, towards the end of the presentation, I'll come on to our assessment philosophy, I suppose, which we technically embraces all these, all the pieces of this framework. Okay, that's interesting. So, do you not have a system in place? Yes, that follows with the previous question I asked. So, those of you that do, yes, 16%, no 11%. Okay, but that's interesting. So there are a number of you that have actually replaced levels. There are a number of you that do feel confident that your framework meets those principles. A number of you don't as well. So what I'll do is, towards the end, as I say, I'll come on to what we do in terms of meeting this framework, and you might be interested in that. So how has all of what I've been saying really gone down with schools? How well have schools reacted to the changes? How well have they reacted to the consultations and life after levels and everything else? One of our trade associations, which is BESA, some of you might know BESA, they do a lot of work internationally. So the British Educational Suppliers Association, they asked the question of schools reasonably recently about, what do you think about levels going? What might you replace levels with, and so on, and when might you replace levels? So I thought I'd put these figures up here because they're quite interesting. So from the survey, 38% of respondents said they were extremely concerned about the removal of levels in the short term, and 32% are extremely concerned about it in the long term. When you probe those schools more, the 38% that were concerned about it in the short term, that was really about, well, we're not dead sure what we're going to replace them with. And interestingly, again, that ties in with some of the voting that we've done in the last half an hour, that a number of you have not yet replaced levels with a new system. Now, a reasonable number of those that BESA researched, 32% were also extremely concerned about it in the long term. And those were schools generally that liked the concept of levels. So they liked the fact that there was a system which they got used to, which told them something about where the pupil was. And also, a lot of them have built their curriculum around the levelling framework. So a reasonable proportion are concerned about levels going in the long term. The next bullet point, about a third of primary and secondaries were planning to stop using levels before September 14, 16% after September, 30% during 2015 and 20% during 2016. So I guess to some degree that tallies with what we found out today. And it's what I said earlier really, that the original intention of the DFE was that all schools had to stop using levels from September this year, so from a few months ago. However, I think they quickly realised at the beginning of this year, when they did their research, that this backs up really, that too many schools weren't going to have a new system in place. So they've made 2014/15 a kind of transition year. It's interesting looking at the figures there that, so 16% after September, 30% during 15, so that's probably another 46% of schools saying that at some point over this academic year, they will stop using levels and move to something new. Interestingly, there are a fifth saying that they won't stop using levels until 2016. I suspect they may not have an option and they'll be told over this next year that they have to stop. 32% of schools answering the BESA survey believe levels weren't fit for purpose for parents. So that's interesting. So a third of schools did say, okay, we can see what the government might be doing because parents don't really understand levels. However, almost half of the schools said they were fit for purpose for teachers. So there was a slight tension there. They understood that levels weren't good for parents, they didn't understand them. But at the same time, they also said, as teachers, but we quite like levels. But clearly at the end of the day, parent power won out. The government has said, well, because parents don't understand levels, you're not going to use them anymore, and we'll introduce a new system. So again, it's all about parent power and the importance of communicating to parents, pupil progress. And I think this last bullet point is particularly important. There's a general question in the survey where teachers were asked what type of guidance and support they might be seeking from a long list of various factors. What came out heavily as number one in terms of the type of guidance and support that teachers said they needed, and that was about national benchmarking. So despite the fact that levels are going, or have gone, and despite the fact that schools are free to use their own system, what the government has always said is, but we want whatever you use, whether it's your own system, someone else's system, a commercial system, whatever it might be, you've got to show where the pupils are in your school and how well they're doing, but you've also got to show how they're doing on a national basis. And of course there's quite a tension there because a number of schools that thought, okay, we'll go down the road of producing our own assessment materials. You can do that in your own school. It's harder to then convince the inspectorate that you've also nationally benchmarked that test because for schools it's just a difficult thing to do. So national benchmarking is key, and it's very important that schools show how what they're using nationally benchmarks pupils as well as monitors pupil progress. So I thought I'd put up here the views of inspectors, and this is again corralled from views from inspectors internationally, from the UK, and I've just pulled these pieces together from a variety of documents and talking to schools and talking to inspectors. So what the inspectors are saying at the moment is they're finding variable quality on reporting on pupils' progress. So they're saying that some schools are doing it well, some schools are doing it not so well, some schools aren't doing it at all. So the quality is variable. What they've also said is what they don't want to do is spend most of their time during inspection trying to figure out how good the school's assessment system is. So what the inspectorate doesn't want to do is go into school and spend a day or 2 days working out what the assessment system does, working out whether it works, working out how accurate is the data that comes from that assessment system. What it's far more interested in is being quickly convinced that the assessment system works and the data is reliable and accurate. It's far more interested in spending time with the school then saying, okay, how are you using the data? How are you intervening in the right way with the pupils in terms of developing teaching and learning strategies for them? So I think one of the interesting points here is that if a system is being used that the inspectors quickly understand works well and is reliable, it will quickly move on to other areas within the school that it might be looking at. So inspectors have said that they will want to know how the school is measuring progress and what criteria the school is using to do that. Inspectors have also said that schools should be thinking about parents on this one. So in terms of assessment regimes and data and everything that follows from the testing, the formative testing, parents need to understand it, and they will also want to know how well their child is doing in relation to other children in the class, other children in the school, but also against broader expectations. So that goes back to the slide, the previous slide, where I was talking about national benchmarking. So what inspectors will want to see is how well the child is doing in the class against his or her peers, how well is that child doing in the school overall, but also how well is that child doing nationally. So again, that's one of the things that you'll want to be demonstrated to inspectors, that your assessment regime allows you to do that. Inspectors have also said that schools should think carefully about the sort of national tests that they're going to buy into, which can benchmark progress and outcomes. So it's not just about measuring progress and how well the pupil is doing, it's also about how well has the pupil done in terms of that progress. So you can measure progress and you can say, well, this is where the pupil might be in X number of years' time, but it's also about measuring the final outcome, and is that outcome accurate in terms of the progress that was being measured. And the final bullet point there, which inspectors are very keen on, and that's where they say they inspect every school to be able to show what pupils know, understand and can do through continuous assessment and summative tests. So it's not just about a test at the end of a long period of time where you might say, okay, this pupil knows this, that or the other, but it doesn't know ABC. It's more about continuous assessment, so that if you know that a pupil's got some weaknesses in certain areas, then you can do something about it. So those are some of the things that the inspectors will be looking for when they go into school. And in terms of the views of the Department for Education, it announced in its has a document for British Schools Overseas Standards for Schools, and this is from its last iteration of the document, which was February 2014, so earlier this year. So this is what the Department for Education is saying to British Schools Overseas in terms of some of the things that those schools should be looking for in terms of the curriculum and assessment. So I thought you might find this, some of these points quite interesting. So the first point, does your curriculum that you use provide the opportunity for all pupils to learn and to make progress? So that's the DFE saying it's not just about certain pupils, it's not about your core average pupils, it's not about your special educational needs pupils or your gifted and talented. The curriculum that you use has got to provide an opportunity for all pupils. The next point there, does the teaching enable pupils to acquire new knowledge and make progress according to their ability? So again, that's all about measuring progress, making progress, about identifying the pupil's strengths and weaknesses so that the teaching and learning can be tailored to suit that pupil. The DFE's also said, do you have a framework in place to assess pupils' work regularly and thoroughly? And is information from such assessment utilised to plan teaching so that pupils can make progress? So that's all about ongoing assessment. It's all about ongoing monitoring. But it's also about, as I said earlier, what do you do with the results? Are you using the results from that monitoring effectively? Are you basing teaching and learning strategies on the basis of the results that come from the progress measuring of pupils, so that then you're identifying that the pupils can make the right progress moving forward according to their own needs and abilities? And the final point there, does the school provide parents, so that word parents again, with an annual written report of progress and attainment of each registered child in the main subject areas taught, unless otherwise agreed with the parent? So what the DFE is saying there again is the fact that what schools should be doing or should need to do is provide parents with an annual report of the progress that her daughter son has made. So it's not only about progress, but it's also about the attainment. So I mentioned earlier about the importance of having good reports that come from tests which the teacher can use to say about pupil progress to the parent, and the DFE here is saying that that's very important. So those are just 4 points I pulled out of the Standards for Schools, British Schools Overseas document, but I think they're quite useful ones to know in terms of this is what the DFE is looking for in schools, in British schools overseas that might take the national curriculum. So I mentioned earlier under the slide about a curriculum and assessment framework, some of the underpinning pieces that lead to a good assessment framework. And I mentioned that we have our own philosophy about this, and that's this slide here, which we call the 4D model, because it's made of 4 segments. So I'll quickly run you through that. And what we do in terms of the materials that we produce, we do 3 of these 4 things. But in doing 3 of these 4 things, what we do is we collaborate with the teacher judgment so that a holistic whole pupil view can be given about measuring progress and attainment. So just running through this, starting on the left, a key part of the 4D model is obviously teacher judgment. The teacher knows the pupil best. That teacher will have been teaching the pupil already for a while, or if that pupil's come in from another school, that pupil will come with accompanying data from previous exams reports or whatever. So teacher judgment is a key part of the 4D model. But then you come on to the 3 other pieces, and this is where we can really support the teacher through what we do. So looking at the segment at the bottom there of the model, that's about ability and potential. So what we say is that if you don't know where the pupil can get to, how do you know that you can get them there? So some of our materials, some of our tests a pupil ability and also their potential and where they might end up. A well-known test that we produce that does this is CAT, which is the Cognitive Abilities Test. And CAT's a test that contains verbal, non-verbal reasoning tests in it, also a spatial test. And what that will do, what the results of that test will do, it will suggest these are the general standards of the pupil. This is where the pupil might end up in terms of their Key Stage 2 results, their GCSE results, their A-level results, and increasingly the other international exams. So from that, the teacher can use the results to look at where the pupil might end up. So then you also need to build in the segment that's at the top of the diagram there, so that's attainment. So if you know where the pupil might get to through an abilities test, you've also got to be progress measuring them to check that they're on target, that they might be getting there. So that's attainment. And again, we produce a number of attainment tests. For the new curriculum, we have coming out in 2015, brand new editions of what we currently call our Progress in Maths and our Progress in English tests. We also have a new science test coming out next year. And those are all tests that measure attainment. So they measure what the pupil knows, understands and can do in terms of the core curriculum subjects. So teachers will be using those tests to monitor pupil progress as they move through the school. And the final segment, attitudes, is a really important one and an area that we at GL Assessment have been developing further over the last 2 years in particular. So a number of schools have said to us over the years, well, you know, thanks for your tests that measure ability, thanks for the tests that measure attainment. Is there anything you do as well, though, GL Assessment, that might tell us about what is the attitude of the pupil towards the school and to learning and to their peers and to teaching and to their teachers? That if we feel that they might have a problem there, we could therefore identify that and intervene, and by intervening we might make teaching and learning more relevant to them, and therefore they're more likely to hit their potential. So we produce a test which is called PASS, which is the Pupil Attitude to Self and School. That's a digital test. It's like a survey, so pupils sit the survey and answer a number of questions, and the reports that go back to the teacher measure a pupil's attitude to teaching and learning in several different ways. So as I say, it's about attitude to learning generally, it's about how well they get on with their peers, it's about self-confidence, it's about how well they work with their teachers. So therefore, from the PASS survey, from the results from the PASS survey, if a teacher can identify that the pupil might have an issue with something or other that might potentially hold them back in terms of their teaching and learning, they can intervene and they can do something about that. And if you do something about that attitude to schooling, attitude to teachers, to peers and the others, it is more likely then that the pupil will hit their potential and ability. So if you put these 4 pieces together in our 4D model, and as I say, 3 of those 4 pieces we provide in the form of our materials to support the teacher judgment, which is the 4th piece of the 4D model, then you have a complete assessment system for use in the school. The pupil is central to it, So you get a whole pupil view. And from these 4 segments, it's the data coming out of them that's key. So if you put that data together, then you get a very strong picture of where the pupil is, where the pupil can get to, how best you can get the pupil there, and so that you de-risk the likely shock of lack of performance in final exams, because you're measuring the pupil all the way through the system. So just let me recap then in terms of that 4D model. So what you want to be looking for in terms of introducing an assessment system, so key points of an assessment system, these are some of the key things. You want to be looking at something that tracks pupil progress against expectations. You want to be looking at something that diagnoses areas of pupil weakness, therefore that can also support teacher planning. You'll want something that enables teachers to report to parents, and you'll also want something that provides information for key transition points. So they're some of the underpinning pieces of an assessment system which our 4D model more than caters for. So finally, really, I mean, my very final slide, my next one after this is a couple of links, but this is the last major slide. And it's all about finding a stable reference point through the assessment system that you use. So the most important question I would say to ask when you're looking at your assessment systems is, will this assessment provide good quality information that can be acted upon to improve teaching and learning and used to inform parents, governors, and the community of children's achievement and school effectiveness? That's the key question you want to ask. And there's a number of places where you can get assessments that do that. Some will come from commercial suppliers, such as us. Some schools, and I know some of you out there from the voting that we've done today have done this too, some schools will develop their own assessment system. And some schools will use other schools' assessment systems as well. Some schools, we've seen some in the UK that have produced very effective models for life after levels. Other schools are looking at those and they're using them in their own school as well. The key thing I would say, as I did say earlier, that whatever you use, a key part of it has to be that it demonstrates national benchmarking. So whatever you use, you will need to use something which suggests this is where the pupil is in the school, this is how I'm monitoring progress, but this is also where the pupil is on a national basis. So final slide here, here's some useful links to us, to the National Curriculum Overview from the government, to links to a couple of the consultations that I've mentioned during this presentation, and also a link there, that final piece, to the British Schools Overseas Standards for Schools document that I mentioned earlier. It'll be worth taking a longer look at that because there's some interesting information.